Now, one of the first things you notice in South Africa is they drive on the opposite side of the road, and the steering wheel, like New Zealand, is on the opposite side of the vehicle. So it throws you off a little bit. I'm not sure that if I landed in South Africa, I'd want to get right behind the wheel right away. But thankfully for us, Ken was doing the driving on this trip. You know, we got an opportunity to head to the city of Cape Town. Now, this is a very historic city. If you followed any of the South Africa history from the 1960s, 1970s, you've probably heard the name Nelson Mandela. Well, Cape Town is the hub of politics for South Africa, and it was also the place that Nelson Mandela called home. Now, one of the first things you notice when you travel into Cape Town is the incredible beauty. Cape Town is built really in a mountain valley and up against the side of a mountain called Signal Hill and Table Mountain, and it's incredible. The mountains dump right into the ocean, and it's some of the most beautiful views I've ever seen. Well, from there we made our way along the coast of Africa, and that's actually where two oceans meet, and it's a pretty popular surfing location. You know, the wildlife that you get a chance to see along the ocean in South Africa is pretty incredible. In fact, we stopped at a marina and they were offloading fresh fish off of a boat. And there were seals in the water there were penguins along the road, and that's something that was kind of shocking to me. I didn't think about seeing penguins in South Africa. But if you really think about it, the southern tip of South Africa is very close to Antarctica. You know, after we drove along the coastal highway, in fact, there was areas where the highway was cut right into the mountain. We kind of came up through a valley and through a pass, and we got a chance to look out over just a beautiful valley. And you could see vineyards up in the hillsides. Down in the valley itself was a little more of the town site. We got a chance to see the American consulate there. There was also another prison there that Nelson Mandela spent some time in. And just beautiful architecture, beautiful homes. Much different than what I expected when I first thought about going to Africa. One of the things that was on my wife's bucket list was to visit some vineyards. Now, I've got to tell you, the wine in South Africa is tremendous. So if you like to drink wine, you'll feel right at home in South Africa. The vineyards were beautiful. They were in great shape. We had an opportunity to visit 3 different vineyards and sample some of the wines. And if you ask my wife, that probably was the highlight for her trip. You know, the Dutch settled South Africa in about the 1600s, and you can definitely tell in the architecture around the cities and even the countryside that Dutch influence. We also had an opportunity to visit Groot Constantia Winery, which is probably one of the oldest vineyards in South Africa. I think the vineyard itself was developed in the 1600s, and the museum was set up really how winemaking and really how people lived in South Africa in the 1600s. In Cape Town, we had an opportunity to stay just off the waterfront at a place called the Oxford House. And this was one of the other things that we talked about prior to the trip. What are the accommodations like? Well, I can tell you firsthand, these accommodations were incredible. We had a beautiful room with a kitchenette in them. The staff there was very gracious about anything from helping us with directions to maybe calling for an Uber ride or making suggestions of some of the places to stay. And this villa that we stayed at was just a couple blocks off of the ocean front and a place called the Waterfront. And I think our typical nightly stay was around $110 US. Not bad at all. Now, this was the area in Cape Town where the boats and yachts and so on would come in from the ocean. They'd be able to dock right there, and there was malls, there was shops, there was restaurants, there was bars. It was really the happening place right in Cape Town. We had an opportunity to spend a night or two on the waterfront, and it's really kind of a neat atmosphere. There's bands out playing, nightclubs there, great restaurants. There was actually a mall there as well. A lot different than what I anticipated South Africa was going to be like. One of the other things we got a chance to do was visit Green Market Square. Now, Green Market Square is right downtown Cape Town, and this is a place where the street vendors get a chance to come in and sell their wares. And my wife and I got a chance to spend a little time walking through the streets at Green Market Square and visiting with some of the vendors there, looking at some of the things that they were selling. We were looking for some souvenirs to bring back to the U.S. with us, and we had an opportunity to find those right there. We also had an opportunity to watch some kids that were performing there, and they were doing some dancing in the street, and they were dancing to the beat of a drum. Well, it sounded like they had cymbals on their feet. Well, what I noticed pretty quickly is those cymbals were actually nothing more than the tops of pop cans that they had cut off, put on a string, and tied to their feet. Now, one of the things I had heard that Africa was kind of a dirty country, and really I found this to be totally untrue. The city of Cape Town was gorgeous. I didn't find litter there. There wasn't a time that my wife and I ever spent in the city that we felt unsafe. There's a big security presence. There's lots of police around the city. The only word of caution I would say is in the evening, rather than walking to a destination, it was pretty popular to take an Uber or take a taxi to one of those areas, because there was some areas in town that probably wasn't smart to be out walking by yourself, especially if you don't know the area. One of the first considerations when you're traveling internationally is, what's the flight like? Well, we booked our flights through Delta. We flew from Minneapolis to Amsterdam, and then from Amsterdam, Netherlands, right into Cape Town, South Africa. Now, the flight leg was about 8 hours to get to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Cape Town was about 12 hours. So it was about 20 total hours of flying time. And yeah, it was a pretty long flight, but we booked our flights overnight. So we got on the plane, had a meal, watched a movie, and then tipped our seats back, went to sleep, and when we woke up, we were in Amsterdam. I'd recommend that. That's a great way to do it, especially if you can sleep on a plane. Now, we arrived in Cape Town, and Ken Wiley, who is our PH, professional hunter, picked us up at the airport. And as soon as we got out of customs, he was right there to greet us. One of the things that we had heard before we went to Africa, that we needed to have shots. Well, that's true in some of the areas, more central and northern Africa. In South Africa, no shots are required. And the shots are for things like malaria, yellow fever, and so on and so forth. But there really isn't a danger of that in South Africa, so no need to have shots before you go. What about money? Do you need to exchange money? How do you pay for things when you're there, and so on? Well, South Africa is a very electronic country, so what I mean by that is we used our American credit cards pretty much everywhere we went. Now, the only thing you need to do is let your credit card company know before you leave the US that you're going to be traveling to South Africa and how long you're going to be there. And I tell you what, it was very easy. Now, the monetary unit in South Africa is the rand, and the rand trades at about 12.5 to 1 to 1 US dollar. But one of the things I'd heard about Africa is that it was an expensive place to go, and I found that to really be untrue. In fact, my wife and I went out for breakfast one morning in Cape Town, and the bill came to 247 rand. Well, that looked like a lot of money, but 247 rand was about 22 US dollars. Pretty much comparable to here in the US. We did exchange some money when we were in Africa, mainly because we wanted to buy some souvenirs at some of the street vendors, and unfortunately most of those don't take credit cards. So we exchanged probably $200–300. You can do that right at the airport, and what we did is we gave them US cash, they gave us South African rand in exchange. And again, the exchange rate about 12.5 to 1. So it took a little while to get used to the exchange difference and the price on things, But after that, it was very easy. And really, with your credit card, the credit card companies give you the exchange rate on the day that you make the transaction, and that's the recommended way to be able to pay. Now, one of the other questions that came up about money is, how do you pay your outfitter? Is it secure? How do you do that? And so on. Well, the outfitter that we were hunting with, Gamka Safaris, we actually sent a wire, a bank wire, to them ahead of time to pay for our trip. And then at the end of the trip, we had an opportunity to tip our professional hunter and to tip our tracker and so on and so forth. We did that in US dollars. They're more than happy to accept US currency. We had an opportunity to drive through the countryside, and we stopped at a small farm store. And what a neat experience. We had a light lunch there. We had something called a meat pie, which is very much like New Zealand. When you travel to New Zealand, they eat a lot of meat pies. Well, we had a meat pie at the farm store for lunch. But one of the other things I saw that was pretty unusual was something called biltong. And biltong is a lot like beef jerky, if you will, here in the US. And biltong, though, is made from different types of meat, and they had all different varieties there. We got a chance to sample some of it, and it was wonderful. The native language in Africa is what they call Afrikaans, and you can hear the Dutch dialect in that Afrikaans language. But don't worry about it. Everybody we ran into also spoke English. In fact, that was one of the things we noticed at the school, was that children learn English at a very young age. So everywhere we went, everyone spoke both Afrikaans and English. So it was extremely easy to communicate with everywhere we went and everyone we talked to. Now, we arrived at our lodge where we were going to be hunting, and it was a bit remote. And this lodge was over 100 years old, so it was pretty neat, real historic area, and definitely out in the African bush. And one of the things I noticed right away is it wasn't flat at all, it wasn't dry, it was lush green, rolling hills, and even some mountainous areas. And it was a pretty big ranch. I think it was about 12,000 acres that we had the opportunity to hunt. And there was game everywhere. As we pulled into the lodge, there was monkeys and baboons, there was impala bucks, there was kudu. We saw just about everything on our drive right into the lodge. Now, my wife wasn't real excited about the opportunity to go to Africa at first, but I've got to tell you, for her to be able to see a lot of these animals, including giraffes and zebras and so on, she had the camera going and she was all eyes as she got an opportunity to see some of these animals for the very first time. Now, one of the things about hunting in South Africa is the incredible care that they take for their hunters. The first person you work with is your PH, or professional hunter. In this case, Ken Wiley was our professional hunter. And really what that means is that's your guide. He is the person that's going to take you out and take you out onto the hunt. Well, you also have a tracker with you, and the tracker is really the person that's responsible to look for tracks, to find animals, and then in the event that you're able to harvest one, really tracks it until we find it. We also have skinners that work there as well, and their primary role is when you bring an animal back that you've harvested, they jump right in and they skin it, they cape it. They also do the butchering of the animals there. You know, someone asked, do you get an opportunity to bring meat back with you? And you really don't. It's impractical to be able to bring meat back from Africa just because of long flights and so on and so forth. But I tell you, there isn't an ounce of it that goes to waste. In fact, that's probably one of the misnomers that I hear a lot, is that all that meat goes to waste. It doesn't. In fact, even the intestines and some of the trail from the animals is also used by some of the locals. And it's really a great opportunity to share your harvest with not only your tracker, your skinner, maybe your cooks and servers there at the ranch, but also some of the folks that live nearby. And for them, this is really their number one opportunity to get protein, to get meat, is from the animals that the hunters harvest. Really, in Africa, every place that you hunt is a preserve. Now, they call it a preserve because it's a ranch, and in many cases, these ranches are fenced off. And really, it's important to understand that in Africa, there really isn't public land to hunt. And even private land you have to fence it because poaching is such a huge problem. The fence is really not there to keep the animals in as much as it is to keep the poachers out. Pretty much everything that you're going to hunt in Africa is going to be on a private preserve. But don't let that turn you off. I tell you what, 12,000 acres, there is nothing about the fence on this property that had anything to do with keeping animals in. In fact, it was probably one of the toughest hunts I've ever done. To tell you the truth, I never even considered that this property was fenced. Now, we discussed that with Ken, our PH, and he said, you know, realistically, any piece of property that is unfenced and unmanaged in Africa does not have game on it. In fact, poaching is such an issue there that any animals that would happen to be out of a fence preserve are soon found and shot. And any private land that is not fenced, unfortunately, gets poached off. You know, one of the questions I get a lot is, how do you book a trip in South Africa? Well, the best way I've found, and to be honest, my suggestion would be to visit one of the SCI, Safari Club International, banquets or shows that take place throughout the country. Safari Club International does a great job of promoting hunting all over the world, including South Africa. And we had an opportunity to visit with many of the different outfitters from the African areas that we wanted to visit. And we had an opportunity to visit with Ken before the trip. We purchased this trip at auction in Green Bay, Wisconsin, at the Northeast Wisconsin chapter of SCI's annual banquet and live auction. And a lot of people say, well, what does it cost? I can tell you, depending upon the type of animals that you want to harvest, African safaris or African hunts can range anywhere in cost from $1,200 up to $20,000. It really depends on what you want to harvest and the caliber or the quality of the animals that you want to harvest. One of the questions that we had from numerous people there were, why don't more Americans come to our country? Well, I think it's a lot because of some of the misnomers that we hear here in the U.S. about maybe the security and it's hot and it's dry and all the things we talked about earlier. But really, it's a very beautiful country, very secure, very easy to travel in. Great culture, there's great food, great people. It's an excellent opportunity to visit an area that's much different from the U.S. You know, people have asked me, would you go back to South Africa? And I'll tell you, I'd go back in a heartbeat. The hunting was incredible. The staff there took incredible care of you. There was numerous staff members to do everything from help you on the hunt, to skin your animals, to help track animals. Your laundry, they did your laundry every day. I'd come back after the hunt and whatever I wore yesterday was washed and pressed and folded and sitting on my bed. The food was wonderful. The drinks were great. The people were great. I love sightseeing anyway. That's probably one of the neatest things about my job, is getting a chance to travel around the world. And I've got to tell you, the South African area of Cape Town was a wonderful place to spend time.